In this video, I'm going to share some writing advice from some of the world's most famous authors, from those who have actually been there and done it. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
When you write, your words must go like this. Bim, 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 bim. Each line must be full of a delicious little juice, flavor. They must be full of power. They must make you like to turn a page. Bim, bim, bim. What these guys do, they say, well, in blah, 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 da, 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 there was a porch chair. The flies were walking around. You see, they're too leisurely. They're setting up the scene for the grand emotion, and when they get to the grand emotion, there isn't any. This is a different age. It's the atomic age. Each line must have its own power, its own feeling, its own juice, its own flavor. Writing must never be boring. It must not bore the reader, the writer. It must not bore anybody. You have to have juice in each line, don't you see? You don't believe me, but I'm trying to tell you. I get so... Writers put me to sleep. They always did. They always will. Each line must be an entity unto itself.
After the success of the film of The World According to Garp, people asked me if I was interested in being a director. I said that when I felt like being a director, I wrote a novel. The novel, to me, is a demonstration of emotional and psychological truths. It's not an intellectual exercise. I don't see myself as an intellectual. I don't even see myself as an artist. I think of myself as a craftsman. The craft of a novel is simply to make the story better, more compelling, more unstoppable on page 400 than it was on page 40. You have to make the reader interested in the characters before the reader cares about what happens to the characters. And there has to be some kind of emotional payoff at the end. My novels are driven by what happens at the end. I've never written a novel where I didn't see the ending before I began, and it was what happened at the end of that story that compelled me to spend 4 or 5, in this case, 7 years finishing it.
I'm a slow worker. I'm I think, a steady worker. You know, so many writers don't like to write. They do it under the compulsion that makes any artist what he is, but they really don't enjoy sitting down and trying to turn a thought into a reasonable sentence. But I do, I like to write, and sometimes I'm afraid that I like it too much, because when I get into work, I don't want to leave it. And as a result, I'll go for days and days and days without leaving my house, wherever I am. I'll just go out long enough to get the papers and get some food, and that'll be it.
I was holed up in the Hotel Chelsea most of the time during the early stages. I went through my short stories and dug out 6 which seemed appropriate to ideas, and I sold them all to Stanley. And one by one, he threw them away, and I bought them back, and they're still available. And Stanley decided that the best way to produce the film was to write a novel, or at least the outline of a novel, first. We finally settled on one short story originally called The Sentinel, which is about the discovery of an artifact on the moon, which had been left there millions of years ago by some other civilization, and which I suggest was a kind of burglar alarm to trigger the news that we had escaped from our planetary cradle and were about to invade the universe.
It's always been that way. Poetry hasn't had much of a say in the time of it. In Homer's time, the rhymes say, 7 cities claimed the Homer dead, through which the living Homer begged his bread. 7 cities he begged through, and they all honored him long after he was dead. So poetry gets its share. It's like a very small part of a big machine, but rather vital, carburetor or something like that, you know. And it's only The complaint about this comes from people who usually who can't write poetry and can't sell poetry and can't do much of anything poetry. They think the world's to blame, you know. And that's not the way to judge it. Poetry gets a good deal of neglect, and that's probably good for it. It's the same with all the arts. They get a good deal of neglect. Adversity. Nobody knows just how much is good for them. Some people think that if you could give them plenty of foundation money, they'd be all right. I like to make a pun of that.
Well, that just seemed to me the best way to tell the story. It wasn't a deliberate change of style. I don't know anything about style. I think a writer with a lot to pushing inside him to get out hasn't got time to bother with style. If he just likes to write and hasn't got anything urging him, then he can become a stylist. But the ones with a great deal pushing to get out don't have time to be anything but clumsy. Like Balzac, for instance.
My dad was a cop, a state trooper. And so, you know, people who work in the emergency services develop this dark sense of humor just sort of as a defense mechanism. And so that's what I grew up with. And I think the idea of mixing humor and horror wasn't as foreign to me as it might be to somebody who didn't have that sort of upbringing.
What would you say is the trick to comic writing, especially when you're combining the genre of horror?
It's completely an instinct thing. A lot of it is, you know, the cliche of whistling through the graveyard or gallows humor. You know, you need to laugh when there's that much tension, and to try and build the tension so it's actually scary is the harder part than making it funny. What's funny is just something that comes naturally to me. It's because it's how I react to the world. But trying to make those two things work in Congress with one another, it's work. You know, I have to be honest, it is. But it's usually the scary part that's harder than the funny part.
I read aloud continually. I do not go on to the next sentence until the preceding one is perfect down to the syllable. Mm-hmm. I get 50 pages ahead. I rewrite assiduously. I write by hand. I send 50 pages to my typist. I correct her typos. I redline it in ink.
But then when those pages come back to you, are you reading it aloud again for the sound of the language?
Over and over and over again.
So tell me what you want to hear when you're reading this. When do you know it's right, you know, from the ear?
I want the perfect overlay of theme, moral content, style, outrageousness, import, spirituality, characterization, mise-en-scène. It has to be dense. It has to say a great deal. It has to sound perfect to my ear before I let it go.
If you wish to develop as a writer, you will have to also develop as a person. I would suggest that you will need to develop a moral standpoint, which will probably also entail a political standpoint. I am not saying that that should be a left-wing opinion, a right-wing opinion, or even my own personal preference, an anarchist opinion. The important thing is the understanding that you should have a platform, a moral or political platform from which you can look at the world and hopefully to understand it, which will need a certain amount of compassion and empathy, whereby you can look at someone who has ideas that are completely foreign to your own, and yet perhaps understand why they have them, what the factors were in their background that caused them to have those ideas, perhaps to understand that you yourself, brought up in slightly different circumstances, may have had exactly those ideas. So that is the basis from which you can look at the world without necessarily being judgmental, but simply trying to understand it.
The experience of writing fiction is radically different from the experience of writing nonfiction. Nonfiction, you've got a bunch of stuff. You do the research first, you've got it there, and now it's a matter of shaping it, of getting it. It's like sculpting, you know, it's like making something out of granite. Fiction, there's a dread level, because you wake up every single morning with the idea that it's not worth doing it, and you're going to have to make up something out of nothing that day, once again. And until you reach that point I mentioned before, when it takes off, and for better or for worse, you're going to finish the novel. It's a big question every day whether this is worth, why you're doing this. It takes till about 5 in the afternoon. In fact, I go to work in the morning about 10:30. It's not until about 5 in the afternoon that I actually start hitting a rhythm where I get a page done. And it's the best time. Then once you hit that rhythm, you can work maybe for another 2 or 3 hours, but until you get hungry. But